It did not take a war. It did not take a treaty. It did not take a decade of negotiation. A single presentation, 47 minutes. That is all it took to redraw the physical map of the North Atlantic Alliance, not with weapons, but with architectural renderings, budget spreadsheets, and a single unanswerable question. Why should NATO's strategic command remain on the soil of a nation that has been formally designated a security threat to a member state? That question was asked at 2:47 p.m. Central European Time, April 3, 2026. The speaker was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. The setting was day 2 of the NATO Article 4 consultation process in Brussels. And the proposal was not to move NATO's political headquarters, which remains in the Belgian capital. Instead, Carney targeted something far more sensitive: Allied Command Transformation, or ACT, one of NATO's 2 strategic commands, which for over 2 decades has been housed in Norfolk, Virginia, on United States soil. Within 60 minutes of Carney concluding his remarks, the alliance voted, and the decision was final. NATO is leaving American territory, not slowly, not symbolically, but with $4.8 billion in committed funding and an 18-month deadline for full operational capability. Let us be precise about what happened, because the speed and scope of this decision will define transatlantic relations for a generation. The presentation Carney delivered was not a policy white paper. It was a forensic dismantling of the concept of hosting a major military command inside a country whose leader had just 2 days prior been stripped of NATO decision-making power. You will recall that on April 1, 2026, NATO members voted to remove the United States veto authority and its command monopoly. President Trump walked out of that session and did not return for the April 3 consultations. His seat at the table was occupied by the U.S. permanent representative, a career diplomat who, by multiple accounts, appeared increasingly distressed as Carney's slides progressed. Here is what Carney showed the assembled alliance members. First, floor plans and detailed renderings of a new facility in Brussels, a modern glass and steel complex designed to house command centers, secure communication facilities, office towers, and conference halls. These were not theoretical concepts. They were real proposals from 3 different European architectural firms, complete with construction timelines, budget estimates, and even security assessments already completed. Second, a funding breakdown. The total cost, $4.80 billion. And then Carney announced that Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and 6 other nations had already committed the full amount. No U.S. funding was required or requested. Third, a timeline. 18 months from approval to operational capability. Not someday. Not after a decade of study. 18 months. The question Carney placed before the Council was binding and unambiguous. Does NATO approve the relocation of Allied command transformation from Norfolk, Virginia to Brussels, Belgium, with construction beginning immediately and transition completing within 18 months? The U.S. representative requested the floor and argued that Norfolk had hosted ACT since 2003, that the facility represented hundreds of millions in American investment, and that moving NATO commands off U.S. soil undermined the transatlantic partnership of 77 years. But the argument landed with a hollow echo, because everyone in that room knew that the partnership had already been fractured. The previous day's votes had removed the United States from its position of unilateral control, and so Carney responded with a devastating point of logic. He said, and I am paraphrasing, "The representative argues that Norfolk represents partnership. I argue that Norfolk represents dependence. As long as NATO maintains a strategic command on U.S. territory, the alliance is vulnerable to U.S. decisions to restrict access, monitor communications, or influence operations through control of physical infrastructure." Then Carney asked the question that no one in the room could answer. If President Trump withdraws from NATO while ACT is in Norfolk, does the United States simply allow NATO to continue operating a major command center on American soil, or does the U.S. evict NATO from Norfolk? The answer, Carney said, is obvious. The U.S. would evict, and therefore, as long as ACT remains in Norfolk, NATO's operational capability depends on American permission. That is not partnership, that is vulnerability. This resolution, he added, eliminates that vulnerability. Now let us walk through the debate that followed, because it reveals just how thoroughly the alliance's center of gravity has shifted. Over the next hour, Carney and supporting members systematically dismantled every argument for keeping NATO infrastructure on U.S. soil. The core thesis was simple. Yesterday's governance reforms require today's physical relocation. You can strip U.S. veto power on paper, but if NATO commands are physically located in American territory, Washington retains leverage through control of access, infrastructure, and communications networks. The only way to make the governance reforms real, Carney argued, was to move the command centers. The U.S. representative tried again, warning that Norfolk hosts over 450 NATO personnel from multiple nations who are integrated into American training facilities, research institutions, and military installations. Moving ACT to Brussels, he claimed, would lose those integration benefits. But the response from UK Prime Minister Starmer was swift and cutting. Starmer said, and I quote, "The representative mentions integration benefits, but integration also means dependence. After President Trump's actions over the past 2 months, can any of us argue that deeper integration with U.S. military infrastructure makes NATO more secure, or does it make NATO more vulnerable to U.S. political instability?" France's President Macron then reinforced the point, stating that France has advocated for years that Europe needs strategic autonomy and that having NATO strategic commands on European soil is essential to that autonomy. Germany's Chancellor Scholz agreed, adding that this is not anti-American, it is pro-NATO. If the United States returns to a reliable partnership, NATO can work closely with Washington, even with commands based in Europe. But NATO cannot be hostage to U.S. infrastructure. The funding slide Carney displayed was perhaps the most telling detail. The $480 billion total breaks down as follows. Canada, $850 million. The United Kingdom, $1.1 billion. France, $900 million. Germany, $950 million. Italy, $320 million. Spain, $280 million. The Netherlands, $180 million. Belgium, $150 million, plus the land contribution. And Poland, $70 million. These commitments total $4.80 billion exactly. No U.S. funding is required. The funds are already allocated and ready. Construction can begin within 30 days of approval. When a group of nations voluntarily spends nearly $5 billion to move a command center 4,000 miles, they are sending a message that goes far beyond budget line items. They are saying that ending American territorial presence within the alliance is worth massive, immediate, and irreversible investment. The vote itself was called by NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez spoke in support, noting that while Spain has benefited from U.S. military presence on its territory for decades, that presence has always come with conditions, leverage, and dependence. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who had been reluctant on previous votes, surprised observers by speaking strongly in favor, stating that if President Trump can threaten to withdraw from NATO, he can threaten to close Norfolk. Poland's President Duda said that Poland has the most to lose if NATO weakens, and that strength requires independence from any single member. Hungary voted no. Turkey abstained, expressing concern that concentrating NATO infrastructure in Western Europe marginalizes other regions. But the momentum was undeniable when Rutte called the final tally. The result was 25 in favor, 3 opposed, the United States, Hungary, and Slovakia, and 4 abstentions, Turkey, Greece, Albania, and North Macedonia. The resolution passed with a larger margin than the previous day's votes. Rutte's voice was quiet when he announced the result. "The resolution passes," he said. "Allied command transformation will relocate from Norfolk, Virginia to Brussels, Belgium. Construction will begin within 30 days. Transition will complete within 18 months." He paused, as if recognizing the historic weight of the moment. For the first time since NATO's founding in 1949, alliance strategic commands are being moved away from the United States rather than toward it. The immediate aftermath unfolded with remarkable speed. At 4 p.m. Brussels time, NATO's Public Affairs Office issued a statement announcing the relocation decision, the $480 billion funding package, the 18-month timeline, and the Brussels site selection. At 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, President Trump posted on Truth Social, writing, "NATO just voted to kick out our military command from Norfolk after all we've done, after all we've paid. They're moving to Brussels because they hate America. This is the most disgraceful thing I've ever seen. When I get reelected, NATO will pay for building Norfolk every penny. At 6 p.m., Senate Armed Services Committee Chair Jack Reed responded saying, "The Norfolk relocation is a direct consequence of President Trump destroying NATO relationships. Allied command transformation has been in Norfolk for over 20 years. Losing it is a blow to U.S. influence and to the Norfolk regional economy. Trump did this." At 6:30 p.m., the Norfolk mayor held a press conference, noting that the ACT facility employs over 800 people and generates approximately $120 million annually for the local economy. He said he understood why NATO was leaving, adding, "President Trump has made the U.S. an unreliable partner. I can't blame them for moving somewhere stable." By 7 p.m., Pentagon officials speaking anonymously expressed frustration, but also a grim acceptance. One official was quoted as saying, "We knew this was coming after yesterday's votes. If NATO is restructuring away from U.S. leadership, they can't keep strategic commands on U.S. soil. It's logically consistent, even if it's diplomatically devastating." European media then reported that the Belgian government would fast-track zoning and construction permits to meet NATO's timeline, and architectural firms released new renderings of the Brussels complex. Former U.S. ambassador to NATO Ivo Dalder told analysts, "Moving a seat from Norfolk to Brussels is hugely symbolic, but also operationally significant. It means NATO doctrine development, training standards, and capability planning will be done entirely in Europe without U.S. infrastructure dependence. That's a fundamental shift in how the alliance operates." At 8:30 p.m., Carney held a press conference in Brussels before departing. He said, "Today, NATO voted for physical independence to match yesterday's governance independence. The United States has hosted NATO commands for decades. That era is ending. Not because we want to exclude America, but because dependence on any single member, even the founding member, creates vulnerability. NATO is stronger when it stands on its own infrastructure, on its own territory, under its own control. The Norfolk relocation is part of building that stronger, independent NATO." Let me give you 3 implications of what has just occurred, because this is not a story that will fade with the next news cycle. First, moving ACT from Norfolk to Brussels is effectively irreversible. A $4.8 billion facility, once constructed, becomes a permanent physical expression of NATO's break from U.S. dependence. Even if a future American administration seeks to rebuild trust, that command center will remain on European soil. Second, the Norfolk relocation raises immediate questions about other U.S.-based NATO functions. If one strategic command is leaving, what about the various NATO liaison offices, training missions, and intelligence sharing facilities currently hosted in the United States? We are already hearing informal discussions about reviewing every NATO asset on American territory. Third, the symbolism of NATO physically leaving U.S. soil after 77 years will be weaponized by President Trump to claim victimhood. But most credible observers recognize this as a consequence of his own actions. You cannot threaten to leave the alliance, have your decision-making power stripped, and then expect the alliance to keep its strategic commands on your soil. That is not how military alliances function. What happens next is critical. We are watching whether construction actually begins within 30 days as promised. We are monitoring whether other U.S.-based NATO functions face similar relocation proposals in the coming weeks. And we are paying close attention to whether President Trump attempts to block NATO personnel from leaving Norfolk, which would create an unprecedented diplomatic and legal confrontation. The vote is recorded. The funding is committed. 25 nations said yes. Allied command transformation is leaving Norfolk. For the first time in history, NATO commands are moving away from America. The question now is not whether this will reshape the alliance. It already has. The question is what follows, and we will be watching every step of the way. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.